Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was good.
Very exciting. Oh, good, good.
Is it streaming?
Very good.
Currently
I've
live
got my
streaming.
coffee, so I'm ready.
All right. Okay. So I think we are ready to go. Right. Okay.
Fantastic. Okay.
Thank you, dear participants, students, and also our previous speaker, Ms. Munira Mustafa, and also Mr. Javier Castellan, for joining us today in the fourth session of webinar series on global conflict entitled The Tudeh Party and Britain from World War to Cold War, which will be presented by our respected guest speaker today, Rowena Razak. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Conflict Circle, the lead organizer of webinar series on global conflict, in collaboration with IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center IWON and Secretariat of Political Science POSA IIUM. So before we start, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. So first of all, today's webinar is being recorded and it's going on a live stream on POSA IIUM Facebook account. We'll be able to share a link with you after the event is complete, and we'll also welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with your friends and colleagues. So secondly, we also invite your comments and questions. So please take a look at the chat box on your screen. So if you think you have any question for the speakers at any point, so just type it in there, and Rowena is going to address as many questions as possible after the presentation during the Q&A session. Alternatively, you could also unmute yourself and open your video to directly ask the question towards Rowena yourself during the Q&A session later. So last but not least, a reminder for all participants to kindly fill in the form through the link provided in the chat box later by our committee members so that we could record your attendance, and we'll also appreciate if you could give us your feedback on this event. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mirzat Salime, a representative of Conflict Circle, to give her opening remark. Please be welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Milza. I'm one of the committee members who've been organizing this webinar series since the end of last year. So I'd like to first thank Ms. Rowena Razak for accepting our invitation to be our speaker today and to share her knowledge and expertise with us. And I would like to also thank Dr. Mior for coming up with this great idea. I think we've learned a lot since we started. We've talked about different topics about Vietnam, about Colombia, about Malaysia. We've had speakers from the US, from Malaysia, and also Colombia as well. And today we're having our speakers from in the UK. So that's just fantastic. So yeah, it has been great so far, and I'm sure tonight's session will be great as well. So from all committee members, we're really looking forward learning more about tonight's topic. Yeah, that's all for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Milzat, for the opening remarks. Next, before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to invite Dr. Mio Alif, Head of Advocacy and Consultancy at IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center, and Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science IIUM, as well as the Advisor of Conflict Circle, to give his opening remark. Please be welcome. And Doctor, I think
You're muted.
You're muted.
Unmute myself. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Assalamualaikum. Can you hear me now? Assalamualaikum, everyone. Good evening to those tuning in from Kuala Lumpur. Good afternoon to our distinguished speaker tonight, Ms. Rowena Razak, who's joining from London. I believe it's rightly or wrongly, I believe it's a historical day for the UK and the royal family. We, of course, would like to sincerely thank her for her commitment and her willingness to accommodate time difference and, of course, sparing some time to speak about her work and share with us. I'm, of course, delighted to welcome all of you to the fourth installment of this webinar series on global conflict. Certainly, all of us, we welcome you to what we think is, of course, our humble home, a humble house of peace, safeness, and things like this, right? I think Milzat mentioned we had three speakers before this one. Dr. Robert Thompson with the Army University Press was here. He was talking about his new book on Vietnam and pacification, specifically of Phu Yen. That was very interesting. And then I think Miss Munira is also in the crowd tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. She was here as well. She was talking to us, and we had a wonderful discussion about right-wing extremism with her. There were a fair few questions, and then I think all of us went back feeling quite sort of happy with the evening. And then last week we were talking to Javier. Javier is here as well. Thank you, Javier, for tuning in. It's 8 a.m. in the morning for you on the other side of the world. I mean, we sort of southern people, southern hemisphere people, we band together. But we were talking about FARC rebels and the Colombia plan and all these things. The rebellion being one of the oldest insurgency in the Western Hemisphere. That was interesting. Tonight, of course, we'll have one more, and this will be equally interesting as well. I promise you. We'll speak about the Tudeh party and their role in Britain, of course. We'll hear about how they featured through from the Second World War to perhaps the Cold War. I'll leave it to Miss Rowena, or shall I say soon to be Dr. Rowena. She's currently completing her DPhil in Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for being here again. And of course, there are more sessions planned in the coming days and weeks. I've been told, and we're happy to have it. Of course, perhaps the only concern is maybe Ramadan is around the corner, but we'll manage somehow. We'll think about it. I'm of course Dr. Mio Alif, the program advisor of these affairs. But the running and organization of WSGC is really a result of the determination and the fruits of labor of the Conflict Circle, IIUM, the lead organizer of the series, individuals like Izzuddin, Milzat, you heard from Milzat just now, Hadi, Majid, Farah, people behind the scenes and so on. It's we've done this in collaboration with the IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center. I think the director, Madam Mizan, thank you for being here. She's in the crowd as well. She's here today. Thank you for being here and for, of course, for your support. We thank the center. And of course, we thank the Political Science Student Association, POSA IIUM, for also always being there with us. And I would like to congratulate the efforts in collaboration between these three, I would say, brave organizations, right? It's truly a feat to be able to not only host, but perhaps secure the participation of respected and sort of experienced speakers such as Ms. Rowena and those who have come before her and will come after her. So without further ado, without much delay, I think I'll pass the floor back to Izzuddin. He'll brief you about the area of discussion tonight, and then inshallah, hopefully we'll have a good discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mio, for your amazing welcoming speech. So moving on, I would like to briefly our today's respected presenter, Rowena Razak. So Rowena Abdul Razak is completing her Doctor of Philosophy in Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. She also holds a bachelor degree in history from SOAS, University of London, and a Master of Arts in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London. She works on British policy in Iran and wider 20th century Iranian history. She is developing an interest in the transnational links between the global left during the Cold War. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Rowena Razak, who's going to start today's presentation. Over to you, Rowena.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's really, really lovely, and what a wonderful introduction. It's great to be a part of such a wonderful series as well, and I'm really, really proud of what you guys are doing and achieving, so please tap yourselves on the back, and well done. So today, I'd like to first thank everyone for having me here today, for allowing me to present. Great, thank you. Sorry, I forgot about the presentation. So if I say next, you can press next. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me here, and I'd like to thank POSA, IIUM, the Debate Center, and the Center for Conflict, so the Center of Conflict Circle, for organizing this webinar. And I'll be presenting as they've already mentioned, my doctoral research on the Tudeh Party. I specifically look at the position of the Tudeh Party in British policy during World War II, but I've modified it a little to include work I've done in the last year. So while I'm grounded in the party's role in British policy during the occupation of Iran during the Second World War, I've also become interested in how it shaped Britain's position in the Cold War era. And for the purpose of this talk, I provide some commentary on how this case study may expand our understanding about international conflicts more generally. For the record, some of this paper comes from a recent talk I gave at the online conference on the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Tudeh Party a few weeks ago. But of course, I've altered it to suit today's topic. Just a little caveat, I'm not an expert on global conflict. I'm a historian of modern Iran and British policy. And so while I'm not an expert in this, I hope that some of this historical knowledge can understand and widen our understanding of conflict in the 20th century. So you might be wondering why an obscure Iranian Communist Party may be an important piece of the complicated 20th century puzzle. Furthermore, why should we seek the answers in looking at this party's relationship with Britain? By looking and using this case study, we're able to understand major global conflicts rather differently, while also bringing in other international and transnational issues that were happening in the post-World War II era, such as decolonization, the question of sovereignty, student activism, worker mobilization, and the crisis of the global left. I hope to show you today that by examining the Tudeh and Britain since the start of the Second World War to the end of the Cold War, we might be able to see in practice how a small political party was able to shape the policy, attitude, and vision of the British government and became a symbol of struggle for the British left, thus restoring its agency in this global narrative. Furthermore, I hope I'll be able to show you that there was much happening in the periphery of the Cold War, and that it is possible to talk about this polarizing conflict without looking at it solely through the US-Soviet dichotomy. By understanding British entanglements with Iran, and in particular the Tudeh Party, we can place this within the wider global history of Britain's position in the Second World War and Cold War, restoring it alongside Britain's policies in Greece, Malaya, and later even with Thatcherism and the international tensions of the 80s, specifically the 80s. I'll start with why I came to this topic in the first place, followed by a brief history of the Tudeh Party, and then I'll get straight into it, following a chronological order, literally from World War to Cold War. I should, however, mention here that while the first half of my talk looks at the Tudeh and the British government and its diplomatic service in Iran during the war, the second half will look at the relationship between the party and the British left. This hopefully shows the multifaceted nature of global conflict and that smaller players also had big parts to play. My decision to focus on the Tudeh in British policy in Iran stemmed from two main reasons. Firstly, there was a noticeable absence of the military occupation of Iran by Britain and the Soviet Union in the Second World War in a lot of histories of this period. So if you can press the next slide, that's possible. Okay, thank you. So yeah, so the first slide, there we go. So just a little brief of what I'll be looking at. And then the next slide, if possible. Thank you. It certainly did not receive much attention in the international press as at the time, as you can see here. It was really in marginal newspapers, and it really didn't receive much attention. While most accounts, historical accounts I mean, cover the Axis occupations of Europe and Asia, they do not look at the occupation or the invasion or the forced invasion and occupation of neutral Iran at all. In fact, I see this because it was an inconvenient event in the narrative of Britain as the liberator of Europe and Asia and defender of democracy. Next slide, please. As seen here, thank you so much. It was a military occupation that curbed Iranian sovereignty and brought much hardship and disruption to the population. Secondly, another reason why I chose this period was because the occupation was also the birth date of the Tudeh Party. Quite ironic because this was a country under occupation. And it was also the birthplace of Cold War tensions. I was curious about how the occupation could have presented the best circumstances for a party like the Tudeh to develop, but also how this period saw Cold War tensions with the Americans, the Soviets, and the British all in one place at the same time, how this became the backdrop to the Cold War, basically. and how the emergence of the Tudeh party as a proxy party became a common feature in Cold War conflicts. So in this first half, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. I present how the British, whether officials in London or the diplomatic staff in Iran, were instrumental in turning the party from war asset into threat. I look at the key factors that drove policymaking and attitudes and how the party served different policy interests at key points in the occupation. It shows that the relationship and linkages were deeply complex, that British attitudes toward the party were shaped by wider anxieties and can thus be understood by placing this narrative within the global history of the Second World War and Britain's empire. By looking at all these policy factors, I ultimately show that the British were key in shaping the party's reputation and legacy, a Soviet tool, labor champion, and threat to British imperial concerns. In order to chart the development of the party within British policy during the war, I filter attitudes and reactions through a few main sieves. Some factors were more consistent than others, some fleeting, while others evolved during the occupation era, which of course correspond to changes in the party and what was happening internationally. Ultimately showing a complex web where the nature of the Second World War evolved constantly, and that the nature of the conflict was not only geared against the Axis powers. But first, who were the Tudeh party? Next slide, please. So that's their, I hope you can see, yeah, that's their logo. Iran has a long history of social democracy. The country was exposed to these ideas through workers from the north who traveled to Baku for employment. There they brought back Marxist ideas, and the Iranian Communist Party was formed in 1920, where their activities were largely concentrated in the south among the oil workers. Iranian oil, discovered earlier in the 20th century, was under the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, former name of British Petroleum, BP. I'm sure a lot of you know this famous oil company. As such, the Iranian communists were pitted against a massive industrial arm of the British government, who was a majority shareholder at the time. And this is a theme we will return to throughout this period, sort of a David and Goliath situation. Iran came under the control of an obscure colonel from the Persian Cossack, Reza Khan, from 1921 onwards, who overthrew the Qajar monarchy and crowned himself Shah and gave himself a whole new dynasty, the Pahlavis. And under him, Iran went through a radical modernization and urbanization process. Modeling himself after Ataturk, he was a nation builder who wanted to modernize rapidly and on a Western model, but equated visible Islam with backwardness, controversially banning the hijab during his reign. Even Ataturk didn't go that far. His authoritarian vision extended to political expression as well, and he also banned communism and any communal activities against his reign in the 1930s. At the same time, in the 1930s, a small, loose group of Iranian intellectuals was formed within the Iranian student community in Germany. Led by the intellectual Taqi Arani, this group returned to Iran, founded a journal known as Dunya, the World, which discussed politics and Marxism, and organized reading circles among the country's intellectual elite. After Reza Shah's ban, they were imprisoned, and honestly, that would have been the end of them, and they would have been all but forgotten had it not been for the invasion and occupation of Britain and Soviet Union in August 1941. The decision to occupy neutral Iran was an easy strategic decision to make. It would give the Allies access to oil and provide a convenient land route for supplies from the Persian Gulf directly to the Soviet Union. Faced with little resistance in a pincer movement, the Soviets and the British invaded Iran and occupied the country in less than a month. They divided the country between them, the north for the Soviets and the south for the British. And while the Iranian government and the monarchy remained, these two powers were more or less in complete control. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate, and he was replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who was, of course, the last Shah of Iran. And we re-enter here Taqi Arani's group, known collectively as the Group of 53. They were further radicalized in prison, engaged with Marxism and other communist prisoners. Following an amnesty for political prisoners granted by the Allies, they were released, and in late September, the party was formed, giving the name Hizb Tudeh Iran, Party of the Masses. Tudeh is masses, so party of the people, essentially. Following an amnesty for political, yes, as I said, they drew on Iran's social democratic past, installing Sulaiman Mirza Eskandari as former leader of Iran's Socialist Party as its head. So trying to form connections with Iran's social democratic heritage. Like many communist parties at the time. Their Marxist credentials were largely masked, and they were geared to an anti-fascist movement. As such, their position within British policy reflected this. The rivalry with communist states and parties were put aside, albeit temporarily, and even British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was very clear about this, to come together against the common enemy, fascism. Now we'll go through how the British were guided by external needs and the demands of the emerging global world order, and how notions of dealing with such an inter and transnational conflict as the Second World War changed and altered throughout the occupation years. I've divided this period into two main phases. When the war was at its peak, so roughly 1941 to 1943, with a clear enemy and a clear strategy with a clear idea of who your friends were, and the second period, which is 1943 to 1946, when the Axis powers were in retreat, where your allies were no longer your friends, the goals started to shift, and Britain had to head back away from full conflict with an easily identified army, the Germans, to subtler strategies to protect their interests from allies, namely, in this case, the Soviet Union. Firstly, with the occupation, the war was the main driving factor behind British policy. Together with the Soviets, they redistributed Iranian resources for the war effort, resulting in inflation, increased living costs for ordinary Iranians, and shortages in food and supplies. Nonetheless, the war remained paramount, and with full knowledge, Rita Bullard, the British minister and later ambassador in Tehran and arguably grand architect of British policy at the time, ensured that the coordination with the Soviets and later Americans ran as smoothly as possible, despite the breakdown in Iranian governmental control in most of the country. So if you go to the next slide, it's probably captured best at the Tehran conference in 1943, where all big three leaders seated here met and planned for the war, symbolizing the workability of the alliance and also placing Iran within the grand strategy of the allies. The German threat in Iran remains a cause of debate among scholars, although it is now widely accepted that it was exaggerated to justify the occupation of Iran to secure the oil. It was still a matter of concern that Iran and Iranians would develop a pro-German, leaning. So here's the next slide. I'm going to show you some propaganda that Britain used and distributed, and you can see they focus on Iran as a battleground for a way to battle fascism. You've got little flies, I think, carrying swastika bags. It's a bit smaller. I hope you can see that. So these are, distributed to justify the occupation, and headed by the embassy in Tehran. Embassy is known as embassy from 43, but before that it was delegation. So headed by the legation in Tehran, a strong pro-British propaganda campaign was established. These were directed against the Axis powers and were designed to show the Allied leaders in a favorable light. The most famous examples of these are the posters, which where designers depicted the big three in the style of the classic Persian epic, the Shahnameh, Book of Kings. So if you go to the next slide, I think we can see that. Yes, that's right. So I was wondering, I want to try and make this as interactive as possible. If students can think about what purposes propaganda campaigns serve in wars, please write your answers out in the chat or Q&A box or whatever is available. I'm curious to see, where do you think propaganda, uses? Oh, yeah, you can show that slide if you like as well. That's fine. So yeah, students, please write your answers in the chat box about what purposes propaganda campaigns can serve in conflicts. So at the heart of the campaign at the time was to show that Britain was fighting for democracy and political freedom in Iran, which probably explains soon after the invasion and amnesty for, was to show that Britain was fighting for democracy and political freedom, and that's why they allowed the Tudeh to form. So this is the kind of propaganda that they showed, that everyone's rather jolly and that Iran owed its independence to Britain, rather ironically. This also explains why Britain had no objections to the founding of the Tudeh, and they were assured enough by the demands of the war that the Soviets would not use the party to further political influence, and were comforted by the fact that the Tudeh could serve as an example of how the occupation led to political freedom and expression. From early on, the party was an instrumental part of Britain's propaganda and anti-fascist campaign. With British and local support, the Tudeh launched a number of publications that were initially geared against fascism, which was also a key creed of the party's early goals. The party's other demands reflected the post-Reza Shah era of political freedom, which called to protect the constitution, civil liberties, and human rights, really masking their Marxist leanings in this period. These efforts coincided with the resumption, of course, of the Comintern before its dismantling in 1943 of the anti-fascist campaign. As pointed out by a scholar, if you're interested, Turaj Atabaki, this alignment between the Soviets and the British resulted in the Tudeh also towing the same line, and also shows how the party's efforts can be contextualized within the wider anti-fascist campaign and war. But the most direct form of collaboration between the Tudeh and the British in the war effort was when a Central Committee member was employed directly by the British propaganda machine. The war was also driven by other factors, and something relevant to us was how left-wing parties like the Tudeh were regarded and utilized. The story of the resistance is well known, and the role of the French and Czech communists ensured pressure was kept against the occupying forces of Europe. In Malaya and Greece, the communist parties, next slide please, in Malaya and Greece, they were also key allies to the British, fighting the Germans and the Japanese. In both countries, these allies would quickly turn into targets themselves when tensions with communism returned after the war's end. But during the war, this relationship can explain why the Tudeh were initially regarded as part of the war effort. With the war ongoing and with an all-hands-on-deck approach, their presence was a welcome addition in the fight against global fascism. This attitude changed when the Soviet army won the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, and the second phase began, where the conflict was no longer so obvious and strategies shifted. The cases of Greece, Malaya, and here now Iran can thus serve as important examples of how the laws of conflict can quickly alter and how needs can easily be replaced with new ones. The British in Iran moved away from simply concentrating on the war, resulting in a change of treatment of the Tudeh. The anti-fascist propaganda was replaced by an anti-communist one, and the Tudeh also started to sharpen its focus on workers' issues, establishing themselves in the south and in industrial cities such as Isfahan. As such, it's clear that the attitudes toward the party was much, in part, shaped by the war. Very much linked to the war was how relations with the Soviet Union shaped how the British viewed and portrayed the party as a vehicle for Soviet ambitions. With the war ongoing, the British prioritized cooperation with their Soviet colleagues. But even so, the part ideological difference played were quite marked, especially among the British diplomatic service in Iran. Many stationed in the Soviet-occupied territories, so mainly in the north of the country, tend to have a poor view of their Soviet colleagues, constantly planting seeds of distrust regarding their intentions. British officials were ready to show that intrigue always existed and that the population were ready to receive communism. Initially, with the war ongoing, London suppressed these concerns, citing the need to focus energy on diplomacy and tact. But after Stalingrad, the return to intrigue began. Bullard, the ambassador who I'd mentioned earlier, couched this in terms of self-interest and national necessity, declaring that it had become necessary to take care of their own interests in the same way that the Soviets had been doing. From then on, it was not difficult to recover the tensions, nor was it difficult to quickly find links between the Soviets and the Tudeh. The language of Tudeh activism were also colored by concern over Soviet intervention. The consulate in Isfahan, for example, portrayed Tudeh activities as Soviet-designed. These were all done deliberately to isolate the party from former supporters, as well as taint its reputation, internationally and locally. As can be seen here, the party served as a pawn in the wider rivalry with the Soviet Union, which had, of course, its roots in the 19th century Great Game, which saw the British and Russian empires pitted against each other over control for Iran and Afghanistan. Tensions with the Soviets reached a new high when they demanded for an oil concession in northern Iran towards the end of the war, thereby attacking the monopoly Britain had on Iranian oil. So if you see the next slide, we have a little cartoon here showing that the demand for oil was actually an international issue, and it would last well beyond the war and really shape tensions between Britain and the Soviet Union particularly. These months brought much of the insecurity and vulnerability of Britain's position to the fore and placed the Tudeh from the periphery of concern to the heart of Britain's main interest in Iran, oil. And here's the next slide, please. Thank you very much. That's British troops guarding the oil refinery in Abadan in the south. The party's open support for the Soviet bid for oil exposed the Tudeh's loyalty, something it would never really recover from, and a point that the British diplomatic staff would often return to in correspondence with London. But it was probably the party's reach and influence among the oil workers that really concerned the British. This arena also revealed how much British concerns had changed during the course of the war and towards the end of it, and just how little energy it had left to engage in a conflict with the Tudeh over the oil. A military solution was quickly dismissed, and instead a mixture of policy and intrigue was opted. British control of the oil was not always undisputed, with labor strikes, renegotiation of terms at Tehran, as well as American and Soviet demands for a share. The war had undoubtedly added to increased tensions between the company and its workers. The war resulted in poorer conditions for living and working, overcrowding, disease, and stricter restrictions. These pressures created favorable circumstances for the Tudeh to gain ground in popularity. Throughout the war, the oil company and the British government were well aware of the suffering caused in the south, but continued to prioritize production over human needs. As such, when the Tudeh led the strikes in the summer of '46, it came as no surprise. In Britain, the party's role captured the imagination of the local press, and it showed how a local movement stood up to the British industrial machine, the David and Goliath situation I mentioned earlier. Considering Britain's own industrial shifts and nationalization with the move from coal to petrol and all of that also meant that there was an increase in public consciousness about what was happening elsewhere. With the end of the war, the strike symbolized a break in British power and control, not only in Iran, but in the region. The strike's effects was felt within the wider empire, touching oil workers in Kuwait, and saw the inclusion of Indian communists as well. This just before the independence of India in '47. From India to in London, there were concerns about the party's reach going beyond. With the Labour government in power since 1945, governmental concerns were varied through and reflected in a contradictory attitude towards how Britain would feature in this new global world order with Soviet Union on one side and the Americans on the other. Empire remained significant, but concerns for workers' rights and the creation of welfare state were also prioritized, mainly because Britain knew that it would not be able to compete in the wider conflict that was developing. Ernest Bevin, who was the Foreign Secretary under Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, and the Minister of Labour and National Service during the war, spearheaded this new policy of Britain. And in the next slide, you'll see him. It's sort of a jolly face here. He saw the Tudeh's activities as concerning but exemplary. He persuaded his colleagues in cabinet to study their program, to emulate and to take on their recommendations to improve the living and working conditions of the oil workers. Strikingly, he even tried to find similarities within the Tudeh party and the Labour Party. However, while this was implemented, the diplomatic staff on the ground also pursued other policies to undermine Tudeh power by spreading rumors, counter-propaganda, and facilitating local organization against the party, particularly among the Arab community. After the war, the British concerns became more focused on the development of trade unions and labor rights in Iran, marking a change of tune in terms of intrigue. It's no longer the Germans, it's more, what can we do to make our position look better here? What can we do to also provide an alternative to the Soviets, to the Tudeh? These were the concerns that were emerging. And so with the breakout of the Azerbaijan crisis, some of you may already know what this is, but if you don't, briefly, it's when the Soviets propped up a government in the northern province of Azerbaijan in Iran and declared an autonomous state. This was largely seen as the first conflict of the Cold War. The Soviets thus emerged as a new threat to Western democracy, signaling the end of cooperation and alliance. Churchill, in his Iron Curtain speech, indicated where Britain would side in the upcoming global conflict with the Soviet Union. And I'm wondering if any students can think about other clues and signals and what, clues and signals to the start of the Cold War. Please comment in the chat and Q&A box. I'll be very curious to hear what you have to say started the Cold War as well. Dr. Louise Fawcett, who has written a very fantastic book on Iran and the Cold War, places Iran as a birthplace of tensions and international pressure, and certainly is a key framework of British policy. Thank you. You can change the slide if you like, that's no problem, of British post-war policy towards Iran. In addition, I found that British governmental concerns over the Tudeh in the early Cold War is important to show how governments engaged with non-British, in this case, smaller players, by avoiding conflict and non-intervention. They guised their more covert strategies by saying that it was protecting Iranian sovereignty. So in the second bit of this paper, it's actually more like the last quarter of this paper, I'll turn my attention to the position of the Tudeh and Britain during the Cold War. I have to admit that this is still very much a work in progress for me, but I'd like to share what I've uncovered so far. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to how the party came to serve the interests and causes of the British left instead, and as a way for this group, made of the British Communist Party, Trotskyists, and the Labour Party, to play some part and have a say in the Cold War and in international affairs. At the end of the war, the British faced financial hardships, the need for rebuilding, the breakdown of its empire, and increased tensions in the Middle East, South Asia, and of course our part of the world in Southeast Asia, where all of these became new arenas of the Cold War. Relations with the US were not exactly strong. Roosevelt's successor Truman no longer guaranteed the Lend-Lease agreement, while Britain started to realize it was no longer the coolest kid on the block anymore, and it knew it couldn't compete with the strength and might of the US. So if you go to the next slide, this is the start of the new order of things. Here we go, Attlee, Truman, and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. So this is the new era that we're in. Instead, Attlee himself started to look inwards to furthering the social agenda with the National Health Service and also on safeguarding the empire. From here, another departure can be observed, where the Labour government regarded the Tudeh of less of a threat in terms of its ability to further Soviet ambitions, but rather as a rival in spearheading improvements for the workforce in Iran and as an imperial concern. But how do you fight a party when your resources are low? This came to light when the World Federation of Trade Unions sent a delegation to Iran in 1947, which saw the British embassy take an interest in their attitudes and relations with the Tudeh. London was becoming increasingly interested in leaving a mark on labor rights. At this point, British policy was not interested in openly interfering in Iranian affairs, simply couldn't. Even when the Ministry of Labor openly declared it would protect any group of persons who defended workers, it didn't mean the Tudeh. And when it came to breaking down the party's hold on trade unionism in Iran, the British embassy in Tehran subtly influenced international opinion against the party and refused to intervene when Reza Rusta, the party leader, was arrested. As such, their decision to pick and choose when to interfere revealed their unwillingness rather, to help the party, further seeing it as a rival. But with the return of Winston Churchill in 1951, his hawkish government saw Britain becoming more open about intervening and even spearheaded the coup that would overthrow Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the oil. And this was a way that they could prevent the Tudeh from gaining ground and stopping communism from taking a hold in the Middle East. Around the same time, the British left were also starting to develop an interest in the Tudeh. The Tudeh, as I already mentioned, had started to appear in local newspapers in Britain during the 1946 oil strikes and was described in the newspaper The Scotsman as, I quote, a genuine political popular movement, end quote. British Communist Party leader Raj Palme-Dutt, for instance, saw key links between British imperial interests in Iran with the wider fight for national sovereignty, drawing Iran into their stand for decolonization. So in the next slide, you'll see some handwritten notes revealing, thank you so much, revealing how he regarded the long trajectory of British imperialism in Iran and noting the key links between Lord Curzon, oil, and Iran's political development. In British newspapers, Tudeh party leader Iraj Eskandari's views were widely quoted, capturing the party's stand on empire, for instance, and I quote, "We believe that although the British government may be progressive at home, it is still imperialist abroad, and that it is supporting all these elements in Iran, which we regard as reactionary," end quote, accurately capturing the Tudeh as caught between labor interests and imperial needs. Local journalists astutely depicted British control over oil as imperial in nature, furthering the notion that the party was a threat to British imperial interests, especially after the party was already calling for nationalization of oil during the oil strikes of 46. And during the oil crisis of the 50s, after Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, the British Republic were reintroduced to the Tudeh, where the media focused on the party's role, but placed it within Cold War rhetoric as a vehicle of communism and Soviet intervention. This was, of course, the height of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the presidency of Ike Eisenhower and premiership of Churchill, who all gave the go-ahead for the coup that overthrew Mossadegh. So further again, drawing Iran into the Cold War conflict, and with the Tudeh as playing a huge role in that conflict. However, this time also coincided with a decline in the British Communist Party. Their fervor had been lost after the war. Assimilated into the mainstream, their leaders had lost their radicalism, and with the Labour Party advancing many social policies, the party's demands seemed to be fulfilled. Furthermore, the post-war era saw the clashing with British Trotskyists who challenged the Communist Party's closeness to Moscow. The Tudeh were treated in a similar light as a tool of the Soviet Union, a pawn in the Cold War game, and therefore with agendas that could not be trusted by many in the left. And this is one of the other conflicts of the Cold War that we don't really see, and that is between the global left in itself, those who are anti-Soviet Union, pro-Soviet Union, anti-Maoist, pro-Maoist, and all of that. So that's also an interesting arena in which we can view Cold War conflicts as well. In Iran, the Tudeh faced severe crackdowns and were forced underground, and a majority of their leadership fled abroad, mainly to the Eastern Bloc. Some found themselves in the UK, where they established themselves in the country throughout the 60s and 70s, based in southwest London, as it happens. The Sazman-e Hizb-e Tudeh Irani Dar Britannia, the organization of the Tudeh Party of Iran in Britain, was the main party arm that promoted and highlighted the plight of three main groups in Iran, the workers, the women, and youth. Before this organization was set up, the Tudeh had already been publishing in English, so they were already quite well spread. Britain was also the location of Iranian activism in general. From the late 60s, students became more politically involved, especially in protests against the Vietnam War. Their anti-war stance is widely remembered and seen as another kind of symbol of the Cold War, one of peace, protest, and freedom. From the early 70s, the Confederation of Iranian Students became more active and vocal in opposing Mohammad Reza Shah, who had gained substantial power after the coup and had become closely aligned with the US. He had made Iran, ironically, as a key component of American Cold War policy in the Cold War, famously remembered as the policeman of the Persian Gulf. In 1973, Iranian students publicly condemned Iranian military intervention in Doha, which is again another Cold War conflict, and called the Shah the gendarme of world imperialism in the Gulf. So these kinds of oppositions were also a reaction to the brutal suppression of the left in Iran. In Britain, student activism was also on the rise, especially among university students who became involved in the activities of various left-wing groups. These protests were in large part a reaction to wider conflicts and a way for the more marginal left-wing groups to have their say. The British left at this point were relatively inactive and not as influential in the wider tensions between East and West or in the global left movement, especially when compared to their French and Italian counterparts. So by adopting Iran and adopting the Tudeh's plight, they were able to have some sort of say and link themselves with the wider Cold War. The 1979 revolution presented another opportunity for the British left to become vocal and use the Tudeh to further their own agendas. So next slide, please. Thank you. Coinciding with an increase in Cold War tensions, coupled with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's crackdown on the miners and the move towards privatization, Iran and the Tudeh became a new cause on which the left in Britain could pin their hopes and causes, particularly by linking the workers' cause in Britain with that of Iranian workers. By adopting the Iranian worker as a symbol of revolution and struggle, they were able to globalize their own fight and be a part of a wider and more global struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and so on and so forth. As we reach the end of this talk, I thought I'd offer some concluding remarks regarding the position of the Tudeh in British policy and within the British left. I think I've got a final slide, I think. Yeah, there we go. So here are some pictures, some posters during the Second World War. These are just posters to show that Britain was fighting for freedom and sort of couching the Second World War as this conflict for freedom, for Iran's sovereignty, all during the occupation. And on the right, we've got some really interesting posters and newspaper articles symbolizing how the British left used Iranian workers to be a part of the wider Cold War and international conflicts that were happening as well. Here it says the revolution, but there's one on the Iran-Iraq war as well. So the duality of British approach to the party, as seen during and after the war, revealed the complex nature of British policymaking in Iran, able to be contradictory and to encompass different attitudes while protecting their interests and fulfilling strategic needs. For example, saying that they were fighting for Iranian freedom while at the same time militarily occupying and curbing Iran's freedom. During the war and in the early post-war years, the Tudeh was regarded as an important and capable political force in Iran. Many reports were punctuated with praise and an acknowledgement that the party's presence was necessary to improve the country's political development. But the dominance of anti-Soviet feeling, imperial concerns, and the looming Cold War meant that an every person for themselves approach prevailed. The vast structure of the British Empire, from London to the residency in Bushehr and the government in Delhi, whose staff members also served as diplomats, meant that the two-day threat were couched within imperial concerns as well. This image would prevail beyond the war, and the two-day would become an important ally and symbol in the decolonization goals of the British Communist Party. While wartime needs were prioritized under Churchill's coalition government, Labour, for example, helped the party as less of a tool of Soviet ambitions, but rather within the arena of labor rights. This period thus saw many twists and turns about how to engage with the threat, and with the downfall of the Axis powers, saw the transition of a whole new world order with different rules of engagement and conflict. While the destruction and expense of the Second World War would not be witnessed in the same way again, tensions existed, and with new enemies, new friends emerged as well. And vice versa. While the British government engaged with the Tudeh in a conflict over labor issues, the party was also adopted by the British left to serve their needs, both a threat and a pawn. It served different interests and needs for different people and different parties. And perhaps, if you like, maybe we can have a think about examples of other smaller parties serving bigger interests in wider conflicts when we think of the Cold War. Who were the proxy players and where were they? Have a think, write it in the chat box. We'll have a conversation after this. So the occupation era and the years following were thus instrumental in creating the right circumstances for the Tudeh's foundation, but also served as a space of change for British strategies in international conflicts. The post-war era, although colored by Cold War tensions, marked a significant departure in how the British saw the Tudeh as imperial enemy and rival for labor reform, earlier as part of the global anti-fascist campaign. Thus, this encourages us, I hope, to understand how conflict changed according to interests and strategic needs. I hope by looking at smaller sideline players like the Tudeh, we are able to bring these peripheral actors into the center of bigger conflicts like the Second War and the Cold War. I look forward to any questions you may have and your comments. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for changing the slides for me. I really appreciate that. So yeah, let's start the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Rowena, for the eye-opening presentation and great insights. So I believe many of us would like to extend the discussion into the next Q&A session. So we are moving into the Q&A session. In the meantime, let's give Rowena a time to catch breath as we look into the questions available from the participants. So the floor is open to every participant who would like to ask a question. If you would like to ask a question, perhaps you can unmute yourself and open your video, or alternatively, you can also write it in the chat box. All right.
Sorry, I just want to have a quick look because I asked some questions in the talk,
Yeah.
so I want to see what people have said. And you said to gain the upper hand in spreading the narrative about propaganda. That's a good response. And you've also said the Cuban Missile Crisis, definitely key start to the Cold War. So, and someone's is it Natasha? So she suggested that ideological conflict and emergence of nuclear weapons, definitely a big start and a big characteristic of the Cold War, definitely. Thank you so much. Milzat has said the same, conflict of ideologies and security interests. These are great responses. I've got a comment from Abdul. Sorry, I've just taken over slightly, but I just wanted to see what people have said in response to the questions I asked. So Abdul Majid has said, we could say that the Cold War started right after the end of World War II, as the conflict members wanted as much influence on other states as possible, especially that many states were calling for independence. That started the war of ideologies. the one who could spread its ideology would benefit more. And that's absolutely right. I think there is a big correlation between the move for independence, decolonization, and the Cold War, and a fight for ideologies. And in many of these new nation states that emerged, especially with the breakdown of Britain's empire, we saw a lot of, we saw ideology playing a huge part, and definitely the greater powers trying to have a say in all of them. Thank you. I just wanted to respond. So thank you so much for responding to my questions and to engaging with me during the talk. Thank you. So sorry, back to you, Izzuddin.
All right, it's our pleasure, Rowena.
I've got a question. Someone was asking, there was a picture of a man. Yeah, this man. Someone was asking the name and who was he and his role in, yeah. Oh, she's muted.
Sorry about that. Sorry. His name was Ernest Bevin, and he was a very famous trade unionist in Britain before the war, and was a Labour Party member. And during the war, he was in the coalition cabinet, where Winston Churchill was the prime minister, and he was the Minister of Labour and National Service. And in the Labour government, which came into power in 1945, he was appointed State Secretary, so basically the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So he's quite famous because he led British foreign policy at the end of the war and in the beginning of the Cold War. And I focus a lot on him because I think he's quite instrumental in shaping Britain's response to the early Cold War, and purposely steering Britain away from going directly into conflict with the Soviet Union, and opting to fight the war by looking at labor affairs and trying to have a say in shaping global labor affairs. So I thought it was quite a smart way to respond to the Soviet Union without basically spending too much money or opting for a military solution, because Britain at this point in 1945 just simply couldn't. So I hope that helps somewhat.
All right, thank you so much, Rowena, about
No problem.
regarding the answer. All right, do we have any other questions from the floor? I think if there's no one first, I would like to ask first.
Yes, please
I have
do.
a
That's
question
kind.
myself. So I really
Great.
like, and I was really interested on how you explained the symbol of struggle of Tudeh party was reflected upon the British left and the British Labour Party, right? So I would
Right.
like to know, would you mind to clarify more on to what specific extent does the solidarity are felt between the people on the ground in both sides, in United Kingdom and Iran?
That's a very good question. That's a very, very good question. And I think it goes in waves. And as I said in my talk, this is something that I'm just developing. I recently wrote an article about this what exactly you asked. And it's very interesting because I think it really depends on what was happening internationally. So if there was something happening globally, then there was more things to be together about, if that makes sense. So it wasn't a constant. This idea of solidarity between, say, the British left and the Tudeh on the ground, it wasn't something that was constant. It moved and it ebbed and flowed depending on what was happening elsewhere. So during the 1979 revolution, when demonstrations were happening in Iran, then there was an interest. Then the British left were like, oh, we stand side by side. But when that subsided and the Islamic Republic came to power, there was a bit of a lull. And then only when the left in Iran was suppressed, then the British left started to show solidarity again. So they became more interested in campaigning, and this is when I said this is what I said in my talk, that they used the Iranian workers to symbolize their own causes. So the solidarity was there, but there was an agenda behind it as well. So they were only interested when things were happening in Iran, but also with what was happening in Britain. So with Thatcherism and the miners' strikes in the 80s, the British also had to focus on themselves, but they needed to link that with what was happening elsewhere. So in a way, it was a way in which that the British left could connect with what was happening more internationally. So it didn't feel so backward. I don't know if this is the best answer for you, but so the links of solidarity were definitely present, but they were dependent on the British left's agenda and what was happening in Britain and what was happening in Iran. And when there was nothing going on, and when the British left were happy, then they didn't really stand by side, if that makes sense. That's what I've noticed. But thanks for your question. It's a really good one.
Thank you, Rowena, for that answer.
That's
All
fine.
right, I
That's
also
good.
open to other question. I think Brother Majid would like to ask a question as well, right? Or also that my question again. Sorry
Oh
to
yeah, sure.
intervene.
That's no, not at
I
all.
also read that Tudeh Party also has their own newspaper, right?
Yes, they do. They do.
So how
They do.
receptive are the Iranians towards the newspaper?
Oh, that's a good question. So they had quite a few newspapers throughout their career. So in the beginning, in the 1940s, you had Mardom and Rahbar, and I think another one for the youth. Actually, it was very popular. The Iranian population quite liked reading Tudeh newspapers because it covered a lot of aspects of Iranian society and intellectual discussion. But it was popular in the sense that it was only popular within the urban circles, within people in Tehran, intellectuals. And the Tudeh, it's one of these parties that, again, it followed a trend. So you'll meet a lot of Iranians whose uncles and aunts were all members of the party and all read these newspapers. But because they were the most recognizable opposition party to the Shah, so a lot of people sort of went on that trend. But ultimately, the newspaper was seen also as a vehicle for the Soviet Union. So because it wasn't very independent, it lost a lot of readers. So over time, these newspapers were not as popular as they were in the 40s. So in the 40s, they were exciting, it was interesting, but then you had a lot of newspapers at the same time. So they kind of got a little bit diluted. But I'll say one thing, they were quite consistent. So these newspapers lasted a long time. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Rowena. All right, so I think we have a question from Dr. Mio Alif
Oh,
himself.
okay.
I assume that, is it okay if I read it out? Or
Yes,
Dr. Mio?
of course, please.
Right. Okay,
Whatever's best. Whatever's
okay,
best.
I'll read it out. So, Rowena, would you be so kind to share with us some of the challenges in the conducting excellent research like this, challenges in archival work?
Oh, thank you. I think Dr. Mira probably knows a lot about the challenges of archival work, especially when you're looking at the British National Archives. You've got to be a detective, and I'm not sure, I mean, whether you, Izzuddin, whether you use archives for your own work?
I'm not really used to it yet so far.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting work, and I think you have to be a detective. I mean, if you like Sherlock Holmes and all of these things, then archival work is is the best. My challenge is finding material. I mean, so the British National Archives is very well organized, more or less. So you have you have correspondence between the British Embassy in Iran and London, and the Foreign Office in London, as well as with the government in India, the British government in India. So that's quite well established. The difficulty is finding the interesting stuff. Sort of, for example, military intelligence, what were military attaches saying? Those things are a bit harder to find. So that's challenging. And sometimes I found that things are hidden within bigger files or are in a different category altogether. So you have to really look for nuggets, and you have to go through so much material before you find something that's relevant or interesting. So I think the challenge is mainly being patient and sort of being curious as well. It's not, I think it's one of those things you just have to know where to look and just be very, very patient. Yeah.
Thank you, Rowena.
You're welcome.
Right. So Rowena, you want to add?
Oh yeah. So actually, no. The other thing that occurred to me is that another challenging thing I would say is verifying the information that you find. So you're getting in, and at the end of the day, I'm just getting one side of the story. I'm just getting the British perspective, and end of the day, it's still written by the British, so it's going to be quite one-sided, and they're going to portray themselves in a certain way. So to find a genuine appraisal of the situation is not always easy. So I think one of the other challenges I would add to that is verifying your information. And as a historian, the best that we can do is either looking at other archival material and also trying to bring in the voice of the people that we were studying. So for example, in the Tudeh, although I focus on their position in British policy, I've also tried to bring in their voice as well, as best as I can. Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to add to that.
Thank you, Rowena.
You're very welcome.
There's a question from the chat box.
Okay.
Or Farah, you wanna?
I think Farah first.
All right. Hi, Rowena. I'm Farah
Hi.
from the Conflict Circle. So my question
Nice to
for
meet
you
you.
is, nice to meet you too. So my question is, what are the repercussions of the American-British support for the coup against the Shah to prevent the Tudeh party from taking power in Iran, especially since the US and Britain are among the most opponents of quote-unquote Islamic rule? How can we reflect these actions at the present time?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. May I respond?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. No, that's a fantastic question. Just to clarify a tiny bit, the coup was against the nationalist prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh, not the Shah. In fact, the Shah's sister helped with the coup as well. So there's a link there, and it was one of the main repercussions of the coup was that it gave Mohammad Reza Shah complete power. It got rid of a prime minister who he couldn't control. So one of the biggest things, I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Argo. No, that's fine. Anyway, it's quite interesting. I mean, I dislike the film for many reasons, but one of the things it noted is that the coup is a reason why Iran and the United States today cannot have a relationship. So it really affected relations. It showed America and Britain as those who could control what was happening in Iran. It also took away Iran's freedom and a nationalist leader who was quite popular at the time. So Mohammad Mossadegh became the symbol of struggle and the symbol of American intervention in independent countries. So together with Kenyatta and with Allende, and all of these examples, so Mossadegh is up there with that. So it became a symbol of American neo-imperialism, basically. Argo. So and I suppose to your next question, it's a bit more complicated because while Iran is an Islamic country, I don't think America and the UK saw it as a way to suppress an Islamic nation. I think maybe those concerns came in the 70s, a bit late, in the 80s and 90s, but not so much in the 50s. The decision to hold the coup and to overthrow Mossadegh was really couched in Cold War terms. The enemy was the Tudeh party, who they saw as a vehicle of the Soviet Union. So basically, Mohammad Mossadegh and the Tudeh party, they had a very difficult relationship, but there was a little link. And the British and the Americans were afraid that Mossadegh would bring the Tudeh into government and establish a communist government in Iran. That was their fear. So they went into that to get rid of that government. That was the fear and the concern. This was the height of McCarthyism. This is Churchill and Eisenhower and two hawkish governments. So that was that. And in a way, it worked, because after that, they were able to bring Iran into the fold of as a pro-Western nation and as a key ally to Western needs in the Cold War in the Middle East. So I hope that answers your questions. Your two excellent questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you Farah for the question, and thank you Rowena for the answer again. So there's a question from Abdul Majid. He said that I've read that Tudeh is still active until today. Is it still effective somehow? And what is the situation right now?
That's a fantastic question. They're actually still active today, believe it or not. I mean, communist parties are not trendy anymore, as we all know, but they are still active. They're active in Berlin and in London. These are the two places that they actually have a sort of foot. Most recently, their general secretary passed away actually a few weeks ago. Was reported in the German news. Whether they're effective, to an extent, not really. I mean, it is the honest answer. But they're active they're not effective, but they're active. So they actually have. If you go to their website, you know they occasionally write opinions about what's happening in Iran. So they write about the nuclear deal, and they support it, I believe, and they're quite against any kind of military intervention with Iran. So they have a small following, and they are quite active. But to be effective, not terribly, no. Sorry. I feel bad for them, but you know, it's the truth. Thanks for that question, though. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ms. Rowena, we have an I think a question. We have a question from Ayman Marzuki. So, in your opinion, did the Tudeh party ever had a realistic chance to turn Iran into a communist or socialist nation?
Wow, I love that question. Thank you so much, Ayman. That's a good question. It's difficult. I think from a perspective, kind of from the perspective of the British, the Tudeh party could have, but I think they knew deep down that it was impossible. They were worried that the Soviets would if a communist or a socialist nation government was to be installed in Iran, it would have been by force. I think that was the concern. The Tudeh ultimately were not as widespread or as popular as they wanted to be. They concentrated on workers, the industrial cities, and ultimately that was not the entire Iranian population. And I think they also miscalculated that Iran is a deeply Islamic country. Islam and communism, until people like Ali Shariati came about, there was no real marriage of communist and Islamic ideology. So you don't have that until the 60s. But in the 40s and 50s, when the Tudeh were arguably at their peak, they did not have that widespread appeal in that sense. They didn't appeal to the majority Muslim population of the country. So that's one of the things that I think stopped it from making Iran into a communist or socialist nation. Another reason why that didn't really happen was that the Soviet Union also got quite tired after World War II. They tried to establish a government in the north of the country, in Azerbaijan, but even then it wasn't a communist, a specifically communist government. It was just a Azeri nationalist government that they backed, and the Soviets ultimately could not sustain that. This was 1945. They had come out of a war. They just were not able to do so. They'll only do that later in 1979 with Afghanistan. But so in a way, the Tudeh didn't have that realistic chance. It's the short answer, and there were many reasons for that. I should say that the Tudeh were actually in government in 1946. They formed a part of the cabinet of Ahmad Kavam, who was the prime minister of Iran at the time. So they actually held some ministerial portfolios, but very briefly. But they would never have been able to turn Iran to a communist or socialist nation. Yeah, it's an interesting question, though.
All right, thank you again, Rowena. It
Oh,
seems
okay,
like
good.
we have
Good.
one more question. Is it okay if you take one more question?
Yes, of course. Please, with
Right.
pleasure.
Okay, so a question again from Abdul Majid. How did the
Mhm.
Soviet Union respond to the brutal suppression of the Tudeh party in Iran?
Excellent question, and it's interesting that you picked on that. The short, sad answer is that they didn't really do anything. The Soviet policy towards Iran is also quite interesting because ultimately, even though they supported the Tudeh in many ways and gave sanctuary to to members who fled Iran, they prioritized a good relationship with Tehran and with Mohammad Reza Shah. They wanted a good relationship with Iran. They didn't want to help or intervene in that sense, because it was too marginal, too small, and the Soviet Union were involved in other issues at the time. They reacted. They didn't do anything, to be honest. I mean, I cannot say for sure because I haven't looked at Soviet material or Soviet newspapers of the time. I unfortunately do not speak Russian or read Russian. So, but from my understanding, they didn't intervene as much. Interestingly, in the 1930s, similarly with the Iranian Communist Party, the Soviet Union also did not help or intervene when Reza Shah outlawed communism and put the Iranian Communist Party in prison. In fact, ironically, a lot of the Iranian communists who fled to Russia, to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, became victims of Stalinist purges. So Stalin himself killed Iranian communists because he saw them as a threat as well. So there's an irony there somewhere, definitely. And it was the same with the Tudeh party and other, with the Tudeh party, although they supported it, they didn't really intervene or help when they were suppressed. Ironically, this did not stop the Tudeh from following Moscow's line, and they remained deeply, deeply loyal to Moscow throughout this whole period. It's quite an interesting relationship. But thank you for that question.
All right. Thank you for thank you participants for all of the questions, and thank you again, Rowena, for all of the amazing answers and discussion. Right.
You're very kind.
I think with that we are going to wrap up our session today.
Sure, that's fine. That's great.
Thank you so much for the very insightful presentation, Rowena. I believe many of us have benefited and learned a lot from your sharing and discussion today. Again, I would like to give the floor to you to give brief last words, maybe.
Oh, okay, sure. Thank you so much, Izzuddin, for inviting me and for having me. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I think I'm back. And I really enjoyed presenting and sharing my research with you. It's given me a lot to think about as well. Even when I was going through my presentation and going through my notes, I realized that there's a lot more I can link and a lot more that I can think about more deeply, especially when we think about the global Cold War, international conflicts, and so on. So this was a really insightful session for me personally. I hope everyone enjoyed themselves, and I hope you learned a little bit as well about the Tudeh party. I guess my last remark would be to not sideline the smaller players in global conflicts, especially when we look at the Cold War, that people in the periphery, parties in the periphery actually had a huge part to play. And I hope that's something that we can think about more widely. Thank you, Dr. Mior, for having me and for allowing me to share my research. I really appreciate that. Also to everyone who's attended, thank you, and for the great questions. Milzat, thank you as well. And whoever clicked next to my slides, I really, really appreciate that. It was really nice. I felt quite, oh, thank you very, very much, Milzat. I'm so sorry you had to do that, but thank you. I appreciate that. Right. And thank you to everyone.
Right, thank you, Rowena. Also, thank you to everyone who participated tonight, students, lecturers, Dr. Shazza, Madam Mizan, and also Mr. Javier and Ms. Munira, who joined us for today's webinar session. And again, thank you, Rowena, for sharing your insight and impressive expertise on this field. So before that, I believe you are going to have a short photo shoot session. So I would
Fantastic.
appreciate if the participant can open your camera so that we can take a screenshot by Farah's count. Okay, I think Farah can count when you're ready. Let's give.
Let's give a minute.
All right, okay.
I see a cat.
Alright, I think
Okay.
good to go. Okay, alright. Everyone smile. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Alright, thank you.
All right, thank you. So if you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the Conflict Circle team, you can reach out directly through our social media accounts at Conflict Circle MY. So again, thank you for your time and have a wonderful day. See you next time. Bye bye.
Just a reminder for participants to fill up the feedback form. Yeah, please don't forget to fill it.
All right. Thank you again, Rowena.
Thank you so
Javier,
much for
Mr.
having me. Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.